on behalf of our colleagues in New Zealand, Cooperative Business New Zealand, and ourselves here in Australia, the Business Council of Cooperatives and Mutuals, we are delighted to have this webinar happening this afternoon in our time zone. We know that we're joined by many colleagues across the globe. Welcome. In Australia, we like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet, our First Nations Indigenous communities. And so for me, that is Gadigal country, which is land that was traditionally owned and is still the ancestral homes of the Eora people. So welcome from Gadigal country from myself, and I'd like to acknowledge traditional owners on the lands from which you're all joining. We do have quite a few people registered, so we expect that there'll be more joining this webinar. We have an hour and a half with each other. You will see that we are recording this afternoon's webinar, and thank you for agreeing to this being recorded, and that allows us to contribute this conversation to the global cooperative identity consultation and share with our colleagues in both our own national jurisdictions and internationally. Please do, because we have many people sitting on this call, if you could keep on mute so that we don't get background feedback until we come to our open forum. And we hope to have around 25 to 30 minutes to open the discussion. What we would like to do with so many on the call is use the chat function, if you could, to place your questions, comments, queries, and anything that you'd like to feedback as you hear from the speakers this afternoon. Please use the chat box, and then when we come to the open forum, we will have a moderated discussion, and as democratically as possible, I'll work through questions from those that were placed in the chat box to try and get across at least as many of the themes and topics. We really do encourage an interactive conversation with everyone this afternoon, so please do contribute as widely as possible. We have a wonderful panel of speakers, and working through this with my counterpart Ros Henry in New Zealand, we thought that it would be really a fantastic way to explore this topic around cooperative identity. What is the unique identity of cooperatives? And of course, exploring the principles and values on which our cooperatives are formed around the world. But we thought we would take the approach of some different perspectives. So Ros and I both coordinate national movements of cooperatives in our jurisdiction, so we have a particular view and insight to this topic. But we have with us today also representatives from cooperative businesses themselves, so those people who are working in primary cooperatives, and we have eminent researchers and academics who spend and have spent a lot of time thinking about cooperatives as a business, as an enterprise model as well. And then, of course, we have the forum with all of the perspectives of yourself. So the agenda is working through some opening remarks, around 10 minutes per panelist to start with, and then we will go to the forum. So to start with some remarks from myself, I should have introduced myself formally. I'm Melina Morris, and I'm the CEO of the peak national body for cooperatives and mutuals in Australia. And what I'd like to do briefly is touch on what is actually happening more broadly at the global level with a cooperative identity consultation that started in 2021. So without further ado, I'd like Carl to start sharing our PowerPoint presentation. Thanks. Thank you, Carl. So the Cooperative Identity Consultation, which is being run and organised by the International Cooperative Alliance, of which many of you are aware and or a member, started the consultation in 2021 at the 33rd Global World Cooperative Congress, which ran in Seoul. In Korea. And this was a multi-year consultation process. It comprises such things as webinars that we're holding this afternoon, an online global survey, online discussion forums, and self-guided events in the jurisdictions across the world where ICA, the International Cooperative Alliance, has members. The statement on cooperative identity that lies at the heart of the consultation was adopted in Manchester, also at a World Cooperative Congress in 1995, and it sets out the values that lie behind the principles that were drawn up back in the mid-1800s by the Rochdale pioneers and later adopted by the international movement. And of course, we are the only enterprise movement globally that has an internationally agreed set of principles, the 7 international cooperative principles. So now fast forward to 2021, and a quarter of a century later, the ICA has launched a global reflection on the statement, that is the Cooperative Identity Statement. It spans all sectors of the cooperative movement, and the consultation has several aims. The ICA seeks to engage the movement, both the current and future leaders, in examining the cooperative identity. In particular, it wants to determine if the statement on the cooperative identity remains fit for purpose, fit for the future of cooperative growth, and if there are any actions the ICA and its members can take to refresh, deepen, or protect this cooperative identity. This process kicked off with a global survey, and I'm going to very briefly provide you with an overview of what that global survey found. The question that that survey was asking is, has the cooperative identity stood the test of time under the theme of deepening our cooperative identity? Cooperators from 136 countries worldwide answered this survey, and they were really looking at whether the cooperative identity is well defined and understood in contemporary times. To facilitate this whole process that we're talking about, the ICA has established something called the Cooperative Identity Advisory Group. I am a co-vice chair on this group, and the CHIAG, as it's known, or the Cooperative Identity Advisory Group, comprises 23 people from all ICA regions. It also includes cooperative experts such as researchers and academics, as well as practitioners. Before I go on to the survey results, I just wanted to provide you with a chance to reflect on the cooperative definition. A cooperative is defined as an autonomous association of persons united voluntarily to meet their common economic, social, and cultural needs and aspirations through a jointly owned and democratically controlled enterprise. Cooperators, I hope you agree with me that there's never been a more important time for humanity to find common ground on economic, social, and cultural needs. And this speaks very much to the identity and the currency of the cooperative model for our times. Next slide. In my own country, Australia, we have a very broad and big sector of cooperatives, around 2,000 cooperatives that bring together 8 in 10 Australians who are the members of at least one cooperative or mutually owned organisation. And yet, as is in the case in many countries across the world, we continue to go unnoticed, undervalued, and in many ways, cooperatives are unsupported, particularly in the legislative and regulatory environments in which they operate. But the cooperative model has real power to change people's lives for the better and to provide a powerful alternative for change, which is why this consultation and indeed this conversation with you today is such an important process. It's not just about examining the cooperative principles as they're written, but about ensuring that cooperatives are understood and identified as a socio-economic model that continues to be relevant to addressing the global challenges. And I'd just like to share now, colleagues, in case you haven't heard it yet, that the United Nations has declared 2025 will be the second International Year of Cooperatives to celebrate this socio-economic role of cooperatives. Next slide, thank you. So the survey that I spoke about before, which had respondents from all over the world, found that there was strong but not universal familiarity with the foundational cooperative identity documents, and that's what we're here to talk about more today. The survey looked at what people thought of the cooperative identity, and it showed that in general, there was an understanding of what the cooperative principles were, but really we needed to elevate the statement of cooperative identity to be shared much more widely. Far fewer people were familiar with the ICA guidance notes on the cooperative principles, and these are all resources that are available to us, but we have found are underutilised. Next slide. It is true that cooperatives, respondents to the survey and cooperators are much more familiar with the 7 cooperative principles than the statement of cooperative identity as a whole. But we do believe that, in fact, the principles are very powerful in our businesses. All respondents found that the cooperative identity has an impact on cooperatives in terms of entrepreneurship and competitiveness. And importantly, cooperators answering this survey found that in general, the cooperative principles have stood the test of time and are still relevant in expressing the distinct purpose and nature of the cooperative model. Next slide. So what are the considerations for the movement? We do have feedback from our survey that people believe there is a gap between the ideal of the principles and the reality, the actual application of these principles in the businesses. And this poses a risk for cooperatives to lose ground to other social actors. So other movements, for example, the social enterprise movement or the B Corp movement, in terms of showing that we have a unique identity and a unique role to play in global social and economic development. Next slide. There were many different views on whether the cooperative, what needs to be changed, if anything at all, and whether in fact the principles needed to be updated. And these contradictory views speak very much to the different cultural settings in which cooperatives are grown and operate. There was, however, one consensus, and that is that if we are proposing to update the statement on cooperative identity, there seemed to be an emphasis that the social dimension of cooperatives and their role in dealing with social issues, such as the 7th principle, concern for the community, is an area where we could work for elevating more around the cooperative advantage. So finally, just to close, the next steps are following all of the consultations, of which this webinar is one around the world, that the ICA will reflect on the feedback and the ideas garnered through these webinars. And we're very excited. This is the first contribution of the Australian and New Zealand community to this wider consultation, that this will feedback to the ICA and that the ICA board will review and provide recommendations to the 2024 General Assembly. These recommendations are including any decisions about whether there should be any update to the principles or the statement of cooperative identity will not be decided until 2025, when there is another ICA General Assembly. This consultation around the world has already raised many different perspectives, and we want to ensure that following today's webinar, that Australia and New Zealand are a strong voice in those consultations. Thank you very much for allowing me to give you a bit of a background on why we're meeting today and what the wider consultation is finding. I'd now like to invite my colleague, Ros. Ros Henry is the CEO of Cooperative Business New Zealand, our sister organisation. Thank you very much, Ros. Over to you for your comments.
Thanks so much, Melina, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here alongside the Business Council of Cooperatives and Mutuals. We actually feel how important this conversation is for our members in New Zealand, given our reliance upon the business model. Just as a bit of background, as Melina said, my name's Ros Henry. I've been the CEO of Cooperative Business New Zealand for the past 5 years, and I am a passionate cooperator. My founding career saw me working for the New Zealand Dairy Board, which is now Fonterra, and saw me working alongside the CEOs of a range of dairy companies. So I really got the grassroots experience of working alongside member-owned businesses and really appreciating the fact of how important the cooperator was for their success. As Melina said, I'm joined here today by two of our directors, Mike Brown, who's our chair, and Professor Nicholas Shadbolt. So thank you to both of them for joining us. Both of them have a plethora of experience as co-op members, leaders, governors and educators here in New Zealand. So it's fantastic to have them here today. What I'd like to do is really just give you a sense of the New Zealand co-op landscape, and just so that you really get an understanding of how reliant we are upon these organisations. Thanks, Carl. So this slide here really tries to just give you a sense of the size and scale of it. So in New Zealand, we have 500,000 entities. So that when you think about it, that's not a big number, but in terms of a population of 5 million people, 500,000 entities is quite sizable. However, 330 of them are co-ops and mutuals. So in terms of the proportion, it's tiny. However, that 330 cooperatives and mutuals generate 18% of New Zealand's GDP by revenue. So if you look at that, it's a really significant proportion of our employment. So these organisations employ about 15% of New Zealand's paid workforce. They're a major user of our professional services firms and logistics companies. They drive competition for new market entrants, which is obviously very key for a free economy such as New Zealand. And they have a massive part to play in terms of supporting our economy and our communities. So, as I say, I can't emphasise enough how important they are to New Zealand. So we've got about 1.5 million members of these cooperative businesses, and as it points out here, about 40,000 of them are SMEs and businesses in their own right. So the number of employees across the two, as I say, is significant. Next slide, thanks, Carl. The other thing to note here in New Zealand is that here in New Zealand, we have got all the various different business structures that can be applied using across the co-op and mutual business community. The majority of our businesses are supplier or consumer owned. However, we are seeing an increasing number of employee owned co-ops. And in addition, we are seeing hybrids, and Melina just alluded to the question mark of whether some of our co-ops are losing their cooperative spirit, if you like. There are a number that are forming JV structures along with corporate enterprises. But we see that those principles that we are talking about today are still fundamental to how those organisations operate. Next slide, thanks, Carl. I just put this up here. These are a snapshot of Cooperative Business New Zealand's members, and of that 330, we have the privilege of representing around about 65 co-ops and mutuals. And I appreciate that a lot of you won't know the brands that you'll see up here, but there are 6 of these organisations that sit in the World 300. So if you receive the World Co-op Monitor, there's 6 organisations here in New Zealand that sit within that top 300. In terms of the sectors, it's just incredibly broad. We've got plumbers, we've got mechanics, we've got healthcare, we've got retail. Obviously, there's significant agri sector, there's utilities, financial services. It is incredibly broad. What's quite special here in New Zealand is actually we're seeing quite a big resurgence of businesses being proud to call themselves cooperatives. I think for a period of time there was almost a view that it was some alternative model, which is crazy given how successful we are at them and the size and scale of the business community. But if anything good came off the back of COVID, we've seen the acceleration of concerns around climate change, and the pandemic obviously opened people's eyes to the importance of moving away from businesses solely reliant upon short-term profit. So many of our members actually include Cooperative Business New Zealand logo on their website, and to show kinship with their fellow member-owned business community. So we see that as really important. We're also seeing a significant increase in individuals and groups looking to establish the businesses here in New Zealand under the business model. And as I noted before, whether they be consumer, supplier, or employee-owned, or even hybrid versions of it. So that's quite exciting too. A lot of the work that we do, though, is to make sure that the members coming through have got the right skill sets to step onto the board of directors and make sure that their organisations are successful. Next slide, thanks, Carl. I just thought it'd be interesting for you to have a look at the legislation that we operate here in New Zealand. I would say that most of these acts are driven out of the UK and very similar to what is available in Australia. And so the majority of our members sit under the Co-op Companies Act, but we also have friendly societies and credit unions. I believe there's one of our credit union members here with us today. We've got the Building Societies Act, Industrial and Providence Societies, which I know is also used in the UK and Canada, and then the Farmers Mutual Act, which is specifically for Farmers Mutual Group, which is an insurer here in New Zealand. So when we're talking to our government here, we've got these 5 pieces of legislation that our members sit under. Next slide, thanks, Carl. I thought it might also be interesting for you to be across the challenges that we face, and Melina sort of alluded to this before. If you're not aware of it, New Zealand's just recently been through an election, and we've got a new government that's come in. We run a mixed member proportional voting system, which means we've got a coalition government. So the challenge for Cooperative Business New Zealand is to get all of those different parties onto the same page. And so we work really hard to make sure that there is that understanding of the co-op model. And so these myths that we keep hearing about it being some alternative model, or all member-owned businesses are co-ops, mutuals, etc., that it's actually not correct. And so Melina just alluded to it, and I've just pulled up on my other screen the key things that we put into our briefing paper to our government. First one is current regulatory environment and associated compliance costs are stifling co-ops here in New Zealand. The second one was around the limited understanding of cooperatives and support for their continued success. The third one was around assistance to establish cooperative and mutual businesses. What we tend to find is that there's very limited support compared to other business constructs. And the fourth one, the final one, is we find that there's an overly restrictive lending rules set up here in New Zealand. So we're working really hard to make sure that the incoming government is taking on board the opportunity to work with this business community as we work to solve some of our big issues that we're facing, as I'm sure many of you are today. Next slide, thanks, Carl. I thought it might just be interesting for you to be aware of a piece of work that we did back in 2021. And the reason why we did this piece of work with PwC was really to try and get some credible research done on the New Zealand co-op economy. And we looked at the top 30 alone. So of those 330 co-ops, if you just take the top 30, they generate 13% of New Zealand's GDP by revenue. So we still remain one of the most cooperative economies globally. In 2014, when the UN was celebrating the Year of Cooperatives, New Zealand was classified as the most cooperative economy at that point in time. You can see from the bar chart below, the left-hand side in the dark green bar is New Zealand, pale blue is Australia, and the dark blue is global. The left-hand columns are agri-food. So you'll see we're significantly more towards the agri-sector. In terms of wholesale retail, internationally, we're all similar. However, insurance, banking and financial services, there's a much stronger reliance upon that model internationally here than here. And a big reason for that is that the financial reporting standards and the requirements of the Reserve Bank are more geared to the big institutional banks. So we're working hard to unpick that right now. Next slide, thanks, Carl. Obviously, these are, everyone in the room knows the Rochdale principles. And we find here that in New Zealand, all of our members' constitutions or rules, as they're also known, incorporate these Rochdale principles. We encourage our members to recognise that they're very strongly aligned to B Corp certification or being good corporate citizens, and that's one of the reasons why I think we're hearing a lot more of organisations talking about being co-ops and using that as part of their marketing. We're also very mindful that these principles are aligned with Indigenous communities, and in particular here in New Zealand, Maori and Pacifica communities. However, unfortunately, we don't have a huge number of Maori and Pacifica co-ops, so we're working really hard to unpick that and see how we can actually make sure that those communities can really tap into the opportunity that it provides. I thought it would be also interesting for you to be aware that obviously Fonterra is our largest co-op here in New Zealand, and it's our largest company here in New Zealand. Last year they did a survey of the Fonterra farmer members, and those members indicated that they wanted to retain the co-op structure. And so that was a really strong indicator to our business community about the strength of the value of the business model. We have had one significant agricultural cooperative that did demutualise some 5 years ago, and the reasons for that were decisions made by the executive and the governance of that group at that point in time in terms of investment. Next slide, which is my final one, and I'll wrap up. So I guess, as I said, we've had a recent election, and we recognise that New Zealand is facing a significant changes as we are internationally, and we're working very closely with the government to make sure that they do understand the model. We believe that the model has huge potential to reduce the widening gap between the haves and have-nots. We're looking at infrastructure opportunities, as we've got infrastructure that's not fit for purpose. We have got a cost of living crisis here in New Zealand, and the responding to the climate change initiatives, we see the opportunities there. We see that the business model, as I said, is intrinsically integrated into the New Zealand psyche, and it can reach far and beyond across all sectors, and that the value systems, as I said, are very closely aligned with our Indigenous communities. We also see that our legislative framework, whether it's for co-op or supplier, consumer, employee-owned, or B2B type structures, that the model is very adaptable. So again, we've got some big opportunities here. I guess if we look to this piece of work around co-op identity, we would be very concerned if those principles veered away from the business model being able to be utilised for both commercial and social enterprises. Here in New Zealand, they're very strongly applied in terms of commercial enterprises. However, the whole member-owned construct and the purpose of being there for their members and supporting communities is still fundamental to their makeup. And we believe that the current principles as they stand we would like to make sure that they stay at that level and that breadth to enable incorporating all business models and types of entities. So again, as I said, New Zealand's, we're very remote. Through the coming together and collaboration of a lot of the SMEs, we've been able to establish these businesses and leverage a lot of opportunities. They've been here in New Zealand for 150 years, and they're some of our most resilient and sustainable businesses. So it's wonderful to be having these conversations. And on that note, I'll hand back over to Melina.
Thank you very much, Ros, and we strongly support your comments around retaining the integrity of the cooperative principles to ensure that they, as they are already embedded in Australian law as well, that we're able to continue to deepen the identity and recognition of them as they stand. Now we're very fortunate to have the views of some practitioners, so people working in primary cooperatives, and I'd like to start with Jackie Mills, who's the Chief Experience Officer at Capricorn Society, to talk about the application and the relevance of the principles and identity to Capricorn. Over to you, Jackie.
Thanks so much, Melina, and good afternoon, everyone. It has just ticked over 12 o'clock here in Perth, Western Australia, so I can now say good afternoon. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this consultation today. So Capricorn has over 26,000 members across Australia and New Zealand. Our members are small to medium-sized business owners in the automotive industry. The good news is our membership numbers continue to grow, and this is through a combination of strong member retention and also new members joining us. So really over the last 50 years, our business has grown with these cooperative principles at our core. And in fact, our most recent research study found that members not only have a strong trust in Capricorn as a cooperative, but they're also really proud to be a member. And whilst members do benefit from strong returns, that's not the reason that they initially join us. It's generally more around that absolute convenience of our trade account that really simplifies running a business for them. I believe it's probably more over time that they really come to experience the power of the cooperative through opportunities such as electing their member directors, receiving returns based on their participation, the education and information that we provide, and also our community involvement. Often for us, that community involvement is supporting other industry partners in the work that they're doing and advocacy work that they're doing within the automotive industry. Our research, though, has shown that members don't necessarily feel like an owner of Capricorn, and that really feels like a bit of a missed opportunity to me. But having said that, this kind of unique identity of a cooperative and the principles that guide us, they've really stood the test of time. And they do make such a huge difference for the lives of our members to be part of the cooperative. So I think overall, I feel like that unique identity of a cooperative is perhaps not understood enough, even for those who are part of one. So perhaps there's an opportunity maybe for some more modernisation in some of the identity statement there. And I'd really be interested in others' thoughts on that when we get into the discussion later on. I'd love to see more promotion and education around the characteristics and benefits of a cooperative as well, and particularly that comparison to other business types. Again, just really making sure people understand the benefits that come from being part of such an organisation. So I guess really in summary, I believe it's important for us to have a shared cooperative identity. The core part of that current identity that's really driven our governance and decision making is those 7 principles. There may be some opportunity to incorporate perhaps some more forward-looking aspects in the identity. And by there, I'm really thinking about making sure that our cooperatives are sustainable and continue to deliver value for members in the long term. And we need to perhaps simplify the statement, perhaps, so just to really ensure it's really well understood and easy to educate others on these key characteristics that make us different, because that perhaps seems to be the opportunity for me. You know, we can see that our members are really benefiting from this business model, but really being able to educate them and educate others as to what it's really all about, I think, is the opportunity. I'll pass back to you. Thanks, Melina, and happy to get involved in some questions later on.
Thank you, Jackie. I hope your call to action stimulates some comments and discussion. I'd like now to hand to Mike Brown, who is the CEO of the Marlborough Grape Growers Cooperative and also the chair of Cooperative Business New Zealand.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thanks, Melina, and wonderful hearing about Capricorn, Jackie. Yeah, kura tātou, ko Mike taku ingoa, ko kai whakahaere te Marlborough Grape Growers Co-op, as Melina said. And just before I go on, I'd say that Ros has totally oversold the depth of my biography in terms of co-op. I'm a new joiner and a complete neophyte compared to Professor Nicola Shadbolt, who you'll hear from later and who I've learned a lot from on the board. Also just acknowledging Ros, though, she's been with us 5 years and has really been a peak performer in our peak body. And, you know, we're very sad to be losing her in the new year. Nicola and I have the pleasure of interviewing some of the candidates, and we're very hopeful we'll find the new Ros for the new year. But thanks once again, Ros, you've been outstanding. So look, I don't think there'll be any profound revelations from me. I'm a relatively new joiner. I've only been in the co-op movement for about 3 years now, but just thought I'd give you a snapshot, I guess, of what I've learned about the co-op identity and possibly how it matches with my own sense of self-identity and even self-worth. So our business, everything you need to know is in the title, really. It's in Marlborough, and we're 80 grape growers, around about sort of 2.5% of the land area in Marlborough that's devoted to Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc. We mainly do Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc. That's what Australia and the world wants to drink, and happily, you know, we can produce some very good Sauvignon Blanc. The genesis of the organisation was about 20 years ago, and as a regular limited company, and it was formed into a co-op about 10 years ago, and around the Rochdale principles. Our model is chiefly B2B, so we make bespoke wines to other customers' requirements, the likes of a Woolworths, for example, in Australia. And we work with the Wine Group, which is the second largest wine company in America. And we make 4 of the largest Marlborough Sauvignon Blancs in America, actually 4 in the top 20. We also make the largest Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc in Germany, which they decided to call Island Bay for some reason, but there we are. But we're just starting to move into brand as well. And very excitingly, we have formed a joint venture with David Honan, a great Australian, founded Cloudy Bay, of course, and Cape Mantell over in your part of the world, Jackie, in Margaret River. And it's interesting when you've got a cooperative organisation and then you're forming a new company, a joint venture, in this case, 50-50, you know, values have to align 100%. And, you know, we've spent a lot of time just making sure, you know, we're all on the same page. But the idea of having a brand will be fantastic for us to tell our story, and who better to deal with than David Honan, you know, who likes to think he's returning to Marlborough and doing it with the good guys, which is great. Cloudy Bay, if you don't know, is owned by Louis Vuitton, Moet Hennessy now. So, you know, we're not in the world of Hermes scarves or Louis Vuitton handbags. We're sort of a little bit more real. Yeah, my background is in the wine industry. I was trained as a winemaker, and I left that to work in other food and beverage industries, and also to work for New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, equivalent of Austrade. I didn't think I'd come back to the wine industry. I sort of looked like I'd achieved what I wanted to achieve, but the thought of working for a cooperative was the driver. It was what enticed me back. You could say I was co-op curious, maybe. And I had a history of working collaboratively in industry organisations. I've always sort of wanted to sort of work collectively, and so a co-op matched that aspiration. And what did I find? You know, a bit like Jackie, you know, some interesting revelations around how life in a co-op was different. Stakeholder engagement can take a lot of time. Rather than 20% of my time, being spent in the back end and 80% of the time in the front end. It was pretty much the reverse, especially in my first couple of years, as I listened to all the voices within the co-op. And when I became the CEO, supply of Sauvignon was quite short in Marlborough, and the co-op was not so well known, or maybe not known for things maybe we would like to be known for. So I took a little bit of marketing to sort of explain to potential growers, potential owners, and the wider communities, how we were different to our competitors. And we've spent a lot of time both identifying the value drivers of what our owners get from belonging to the co-op, and we always call them owners. We cut straight to the chase as you did, Jackie, and you just have to repeat it over and over again. We even use a capital O to emphasise and underline the fact. And as I say, I like to say we're the good guys, just like David Honan. Refrains as well, where the profits stay local. So the profits aren't being repatriated to North America or to Europe, or by already wealthy owner a bigger boat. That's happened to me and other wine companies. Hopefully, we're buying a number of owners, a slightly bigger boat, not a gin palace. And yet we have some of the disciplines of a corporate, but more with the feel of a family company. So I like to think, we combine the best of both worlds. But as you said, I think, Roz, you said, often, we find people are somewhat suspicious of what might be required of them joining a co-op. That might be a bit like joining the Freemasons. And, nothing could be further from the truth, because we're all about transparency, aren't we? And in response, I say a co-op can be what you want it to be. It can be low touch. You can utilise the services that matter to you, or you can be highly engaged and get involved in all that your co-op offers, even running for the board. What's more, we have to listen and act on your feedback and to do what you want. So our whole raison d'etre is about you, the owners. As to the business model, because co-ops are intergenerational, or most typically they are, and rooted in community, the model may be thought of as conservative. But I think the risk setting is the important thing. And if there is some appetite for greater risk reward, then happy days. And maybe understanding what your investment portfolio is like. For us, we're doing about 10% of what we do with David Honan. So that's our little bit of play with risk. And even though they've been around for many decades, there are so many ways that co-ops match the zeitgeist, right now. Transparency of practice for a start, but a belief in healthy and resilient communities. And for primary producers like us, the desire to always leave the land in better shape. And I can't speak to the Australian experience, but I'm sure it's quite similar. There's something about cooperatives that matches the DNA of both Indigenous Māori and the Pākehā pioneers as well. A desire to collaborate operationally, certainly, to cooperate in creating scale, maybe. And having worked in a Māori enterprise as well, I think some of the key Māori values are actually express what a co-op is about very succinctly, almost match the Rochdale principles. So some of those principles are kaitiakitanga. Kaitiaki is being a guardian, so that expresses the guardianship over the land and its resources and applies intergenerational thinking. Whanaungatanga, and that's the primacy of the family and nurturing it now and into the future, and the connection of families. Manaakitanga, literally respecting others. Mana is probably a word you're familiar with, commonly expressed by demonstrating good hospitality and having the flow of respect go both ways. And rangatira-tanga, a rangatira is a chief. And so this means leadership. And that can be thought leadership, ethical leadership, or even innovation. And I think co-ops can do all of that well. So our mission statement at our co-op is to improve the prosperity of our owners. I dare say other co-ops have a very similar mission statement. And by extension, I'd say the community that they operate in. If we aren't focusing at all times on this mission statement, then we're not doing our job. I'd also say that, as management, we're there to serve our owners. There's no place for corporate arrogance. It's something very grounding and likably flat around the structure of a co-op. But the most important thing for us as we recruit new owners is that they are joining for the right reasons. We can make someone a better grower. but it is harder to make someone a better person. We have developed a code of conduct that expresses what good cooperative behaviour looks like, and we call out those who transgress, and ideally they're no longer a member if they continue to transgress. And I think you'll always have a strain of individualism among co-op owners. It's possibly what drove them to the model in the first place, maybe wanting a voice to be involved in running their own organisation, drove them to this model. But you totally have to believe in the best interest of the whole team and not just in the short horizon either. And for that reason, cooperative meetings always take a little bit longer because of this collection of individual voices, but we're all the richer for them being heard. So there we are. There's my very few reflections after just 3 years in the movement. As I say, we are the good guys, not just our co-op, but your co-ops. And I would find it very hard now to go back to the corporate or even more avaricious masters. It just doesn't match who I believe what my drivers are. So yeah, I'm very, very happy at home in what I do, and I'm very lucky to be involved at the board level as well with Ros and with Nicola. And that's back to you, Melina.
Thank you very much, Mike, for your fascinating comments. And we do also really appreciate your comments about the connection between Indigenous and First Nations ways of being and interacting, and the cooperative ethos, which we're also seeing in Australia with a deeper knowledge and investigation and interest in cooperatives as a community-controlled enterprise model. Now to our last two speakers, we're going to hear from the researchers and academics' points of view, which is another perspective into this, and we're very appreciative of Professor Nicola Shadbolt and Dr. Anne Apps giving their time today. To start with, can we turn first to Professor Nicola Shadbolt, who's the Professor of Farm and Agribusiness Management at the School of Agriculture and Environment at Massey University, and is also Director of Cooperative Business New Zealand. For your comments, please, Nicola.
Thank you very much. We feel all right. There's quite a wind blowing outside. That sometimes means the connection can be a little dodgy. So if it gets too dodgy, I'll turn the video off. So thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this forum. It's a fascinating topic, and I think one that definitely does. It's good to have this conversation and to remind us about why we have cooperatives and what is it that makes them so special. And I suppose one of the things I think I've found over time is that there is no such thing as a typical cooperative. And when we're going to teach cooperatives, we've got a postgrad course that we work through this. It's always quite fascinating just to see how different cooperative case studies, and then the students themselves do case studies on cooperatives in their respective countries, how different they all are. And so the question that I ask the students is, are they still true to the principles? Because how they actually enact them may be very different. And sometimes it's to do with culture, sometimes it's to do with legislative background, sometimes it's to do with history, tradition, you name it. But are they still true to the principles? And so coming back to these principles is such a critical part of really doing that sense check on a co-op. How far have they drifted, or are they actually just doing them in a different way? But what I thought I might do is
Nicola, I'm sorry to cut across you. It is sometimes dropping out, and I just wonder, although it's been very nice to see you, whether we might get it slightly clearer. Thank you. Let's try.
Hopefully that's better. Does that seem better already? Yes?
Yeah.
I always am more comfortable when I'm not looking at myself when I'm talking.
Thank you, Nicola.
Yeah, so I guess just working through the principles, what I think I might do is just pull some examples together to help just reinforce that complexity that we have. So when I go through the list, so we'll start with the open and voluntary membership. And I look at that and think, well, yes, that makes sense. And then I think, but hang on a minute, there's cooperatives here in New Zealand, and I've just recently joined the board of FMG, which is a mutual, and we are very clear in that mutual that membership is only for people who are farmers. You know, it's a rural cooperative, a rural mutual, and it's very specific. The only people who are allowed to be members are the ones who meet the rural characteristic, whereas those who might have a house in town or commercial business somewhere, we are happy to provide insurance to, but they are never going to be a member. So I think we do define our membership, and I think we had a Bolivian student looked at two fascinating cooperatives from his country, and they were actually restricted by history. So they were based on a cultural dimension. So he had one, for example, that was immigrants from Japan from many years back, and they had created this cooperative in Bolivia. It was the chocolate cooperative. It sounded quite fascinating what they did, but they were very restrictive in terms of who was able to be a member. So I think open and voluntary sometimes has a different connotation. So it's interesting just to tease that one out a bit further. Then I look at something like farmlands, farm supply cooperative here, where all you have to do is pay your $50 or $500, whatever it is, and you can be a member. But even then, they restrict it to, you know. And it goes back to, I think, what is the core purpose of the cooperative? So when you are trying to think, what's our strategic direction, what should we be doing at the board level, you do have to go back to that core purpose, and the core purpose often does define who can be a member. So just park that in for a moment. So the next one, we have democratic member control. This is a really interesting one because the traditional view, you know, one member, one vote, and there are some countries in the world, and France is one where you can't have any other construct for a cooperative that's sort of enshrined in law, but other places do things quite differently. So I think of Fonterra, for example. I was on the Fonterra board for 9 years, and that cooperative, in response to the free rider issue, ended up creating a situation where the number of shares, the number of votes you have related more to your participation. So it wasn't one member, one vote. It was actually the number of milk solids you contributed gave you the number of votes. So the democratic control was still there, but there were different constructs. More recently, I had a student in China looking at some of the cooperatives that have evolved there over time, and they've got a very interesting situation in some where they have what they call core members, and then they have common members, where the common members have quite a different control leader, if any, to the core members. So it's just people interpreting what they believe that means. And I think in the end, it's about making sure there is a voice, there is able to be a voice, but how it's actually able to be heard does tend to differ from case to case. The next one, member economic participation. Going back to that same Chinese example, those common members actually put no money into the cooperative, only the core members do. So they haven't actually provided funds, so they don't meet this principle, but they have provided product. So their participation essentially gives them membership, and that they don't actually have to spend anything to be a member. Just today, last night, I was marking a case study out of Indonesia, where the participants, again, we didn't have to put any funds into the cooperative because the cooperative was formed by the government. And we do find that a lot in developing countries where the funds required to actually set up the cooperative in the first place, whether it be to build a processing plant, a storage plant, buy the transport that's required, buy the infrastructure, is often either through an NGO or through government, people helping empower smallholder growers to actually become part of the cooperative. So another interpretation there in terms of member economic participation, sometimes it isn't in hard cash. Sometimes it's in more in their participate or their commitment to participate. And then you go to the other extreme where you've got share type values linked to the full economic value of the cooperative as in the cooperative. So that comes out. Member autonomy and independence. I think that's just fundamental to cooperatives, and it doesn't matter where you are. That just shines through. Having gone through a number of stormy Compera shareholder meetings that Rachel also remember from her days, you just realise how strongly people believe in their cooperative, how strongly they will fight for it, but as independent people, they are self-employed, independent people who have joined the cooperative for a very valid reason, and so they will be quite outspoken. And I've actually had the joy of visiting some very unique cooperatives in Cambodia a while back, and people were feisty. They were independent, and they knew exactly why they wanted a collective to do what they needed for their community. So it's probably the thing that stands out the most for me in terms of a really successful cooperative, is just how strong that number of family independence. Education, training, and information, that's also, I don't see a lot of dissimilarity there. In fact, if anything, some of the cooperatives that are formed, often with NGO and government help, also have funding provided for education and training and upskilling and ensuring that people are better equipped to get the best out of the collective. Cooperation amongst cooperatives, that's something that is, I think, more relevant in some places than others. And unfortunately, when cooperatives tend to get a little loud, they tend to forget that is one of the principles, and probably need reminding about that from time to time, because it is the glue that holds us all together, that sort of common belief. And the consumer community, I remember 5 years ago being at an ICA conference in Quebec, and there was a Nobel Peace Prize winner got up to the podium, and he said, he was talking about the social responsibilities, the way in which we can try and manage our businesses to a better future, and all this sorts of things. And he said, "You don't need to be telling me any of this. We've got 4,000 people in this room." He said, "Because this is what you do. This is corporate. This is what this stands for. You are all about the social, doing the right thing for society and for communities." And I thought that was fantastic. That was the outside, but it's something that I think sometimes individual cooperatives sometimes forget that aspect. They do tend to get reminded by their members, though, because the members do know why they're in the community, and that's something that I think I've probably gone way over my time, but I just thought buzzing through that list might help. But I'm happy to take questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Shadbolt. You've reminded us that with our rural colleagues, we're sometimes challenged by connectivity. I think for some of us, we caught most of what you were saying, but I do have some comments that we'd love a transcript to circulate for parts of your presentation, which we might have missed just because of the connection difficulties, because you've provided us with some very compelling examples of the variety of identity that cooperatives take, and perhaps that's something we need to interrogate a bit further. Is there everything cooperative that says it's cooperative, or are there some delineations there where you just have to be structured in a certain way? So I don't know if you had some of that written down, Nicola, but we'd love to circulate it for people to look at later. So thank you, and we can come back during open forum. So our last speaker today is Dr. Anne Apps, who's the Honorary Lecturer at the School of Law and Justice at the University of Newcastle, and will provide some insights from her particular field of study of cooperatives as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melina, and thank you, Melina and Roz, for inviting me to speak today. It really is an honour to present on this incredibly important topic, and quite timely for me, because as some of the audience who know me know, I've only recently finished my PhD after 9 long years, and it has focused largely on the relationship between law and the cooperative identity. And I've noticed a couple of people in the audience I wanted to give a quick shout out to. One is Professor Tim Mazerol, who's just posted a question in the chat about defining what a cooperative is and the lack of research on that. And also Gary Cronin, who is an incredibly experienced practitioner and is doing his own PhD at the moment. And I've had some incredibly interesting conversations with Gary about cooperative identity. But I also wanted to acknowledge Balu Iyer, who's the Regional Director of ICA Asia Pacific, and to thank him for nominating me onto the ICA Law Committee, where I've learned a great deal about different legal systems and how different legal systems interact with co-op law generally and the co-op principles. So Carl, if you can just move onto the first slide for me, that would be great. Okay, I realise that something I'm about to say clashes a little bit with Roz, something that Roz said. So I want to apologise in advance, because it's all about interpretation and perspective, and of course, you know, the way you come at something and the way you define it. But I wanted to start by making a point that in my world as a lawyer, and I started out as very much as a practitioner who worked in the field of small business, setting up small businesses, and then moved into academia where I taught company law and still do. And I was really, really interested in the differences between companies and cooperatives, how they differ as legal models, what makes them different. And in my way of thinking, you know, when you talk about business ownership, and here I'm talking about public ownership. So by that, and Nicola made the point that some co-ops, despite the principle of open membership, they have a very defined membership, but they are still members of the public who can come into the business. So in my way of thinking, there's only really 2 models of business ownership. One is where the member's main role is as an investor, and the other is where the member's main role is as a user. And that member-owned business model, which is the user-owned business model, encompasses cooperatives and mutuals. Now, the problem that Roz and I sort of run into here is a definitional problem as what is a mutual and how does that fit. But I take a very broad view of what is a mutual, and essentially it's a member-owned business that's not a cooperative, or it's closely associated with the cooperative movement, but it is not necessarily registered cooperative under co-op law. And the reason for the anomaly there goes back to the history, where when business models were emerging, I would say contemporary business models, and I'm talking about the 1840s. So when modern company law was emerging, that was the time that cooperative law was emerging in the United Kingdom. And at that time, they wanted to encourage co-ops. Co-ops already existed along with mutuals, but co-ops they identified as more likely to be involved in commercial enterprise or trading enterprise. So because they needed to be able to access member capital, they needed the benefit of incorporation and limited liability. So separate legislative frameworks were set up for cooperatives in the United Kingdom, and that model has sort of been transplanted all around the world. And adapted to different legal systems, and adapted to different countries' different political and economic circumstances. I just wanted to drop in here that when I say there are 2 main types of public ownership, and one of the dilemmas and frustrations that is facing the peak bodies at the moment is dealing with this sort of surge of interest in what we call social enterprises. And just to mention that they are not a type of business ownership model. They describe a particular purpose, but they don't describe a model of ownership. So many different types of businesses can be social enterprises if they have a social purpose. And as Melina often reminds us, cooperatives were the original social enterprise because their social output came just from being a cooperative. So we talk about the differences in the way that co-ops and mutuals have emerged from their history, particularly their history in the United Kingdom. I just wanted to ask Carl to move the slide, please. And so when we talk about the emergence of co-ops who, with their own enabling legislation, then we have this question of identity. And one of the things that I was sort of constantly looking at was, what is the difference between the co-op identity and the co-op's legal identity? They're not the same, but they are necessarily connected and related. So while the cooperative identity I would describe as the universal identity that's encapsulated in the agreed upon cooperative principles and values, the co-op's legal identity is the way that laws enable cooperatives to exist in a particular country, and the extent to which those laws operationalise the cooperative principles varies significantly from country to country. And that was something that Nicola was just talking about, the whole range of reasons why the identity may operationalise all or some of the cooperative principles. One of the things that I have sort of engaged with a lot on the Cooperative Law Committee is the difference between the way civil law countries and common law countries engage or operationalise the cooperative principles. And it's worth thinking about, because in this seminar we're looking at Australia and New Zealand, both common law countries with a strong English heritage, and the way our business laws have emerged is very different than those in civil law countries, which is probably a bigger area around the world. More countries have a civil law system than a common law system. But in common law countries, we have much more flexible frameworks for businesses, and that means that we're less likely to codify or operationalise the cooperative principles in our legal framework. Next slide, please, Carl. So one of the things that we need to think about as we think about the cooperative identity is what's happening in that interface between the cooperative principles and law. And I know that from the perspective of businesses, you often think about the law as a very much a national thing because it emanates from national governments, and legislative frameworks come from legal systems that exist in a country. But the biggest threat, well, from my perspective, the biggest threat that has emerged has been globalization, simply because we have seen a much greater influence of trading partners and ideas about how global finance moves around the world. And to enable the free flow of trade and capital around the world, national governments have been under a great deal of pressure to harmonise and homogenise their business laws. And this has put a lot of pressure on the cooperative identity. And that's one of the challenges that we've been facing probably since the mid-80s. So one consequence is isomorphism, which is where co-op law adapts to the pressure by making the co-op model look more like the company model. And we've seen New Zealand is interesting because it has a hybrid model, and I'm not somebody that's opposed to hybrid models, but I think that the hybridity of the model needs to be recognised and thought about. In a country like Australia, where we essentially had quite a good legal model for cooperatives, we have a hugely different legal problem. And that legal problem comes out of being a federation and the centralisation of business law that happened in from the 1990s on, and the centralisation of our main business regulatory bodies at the federal level. So we've got the ACCC and APRA and ASIC. They wield a huge amount of regulatory power, and co-ops have been left behind because they're a state regulated model, and they find it really hard to get a seat at the policy table. And Melina has been working so hard to make sure that the voice of the cooperative sector is heard at the national level. But this is a different type of problem that's a consequence, really, of globalisation. Because in Australia, we felt it more as demutualisation rather than isomorphism, and we've had a shrinking cooperative sector at the state level. Still a good, solid mutual sector, thank heavens, but these are sort of problems that are brought about, and the impacts on the cooperative identity that are brought about by its interaction with legal systems. Next slide, thanks, Carl. Okay, I'm not going to talk too much about, because I need to give the members that have sat through all of these presentations time to have a chat. And I think Nicola did a great job talking about the operationalisation of co-op principles. And I've already made the point that I think Australian cooperative national law operationalises the principles quite well, but that is not enough. So the next slide is relevant, because that tells us that what is really important in common law countries where you don't have operationalised legal frameworks for cooperatives, that you have really strong cooperative governance. And cooperative governance is not the same as corporate governance. It needs to think long and hard about what the business does to operationalise the cooperative principles. And I just have got a link there to the BCCM's cooperative governance principles, which refer back to the cooperative principles. Next slide. Thank you. So one of the misconceptions about the cooperative principles is that they stand alone. They actually are an interconnected framework that articulates an identity for cooperatives. And it is a very flexible identity, which makes it really difficult to define clearly what a cooperative is. But when you, from the perspective of cooperative governance, and Tim's done some great work on this, when you think about how those principles can work together to provide value to members, then just the role of cooperative governance in thinking about how the principles interact and produce value for the members creates a business model, which we all know, because we're all passionate cooperators, tends to be a very resilient and strong model for business. Next slide. So, just the last point is that to protect and preserve the cooperative identity, the principles need to be understood. And I know I haven't talked much about the detail of the principles, but, just sending that message out there to cooperative boards that they need to become familiar with the principles and understand how they work together. And even if you haven't done so in the past, one of the reasons why the International Year of Cooperatives is so important is it brings attention to the framework, and this is the same. This consultation is really important because it makes co-ops sit down and think about their principles and how they operationalize them. And that process of reviewing is really, really powerful, because they shouldn't be principles that are dead. They should be principles that are alive and active, and that's part of cooperative democracy and cooperation among cooperatives worldwide. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. Some very interesting perspectives there, and I'm so glad that you've pointed to the importance of us being able to actually just dwell and reflect on our principles, which in the rush to engage members and do business, we probably don't, as cooperative business leaders, provide enough space for. We have some time, but not a lot, for some of the comments and questions in the chat box. So I'm going to just start from the first question or commentary, which is from the Regional Director of the ICA's Asia Pacific region, Balu Iyer. Thank you for attending, Balu. And you have noted, particularly in the presentations of Jackie and Mike, that we've talked about cooperative members being unaware of their, or less than aware of their role of ownership or as owners, and that that was pointed out to be a lost opportunity. So perhaps for the panel, and starting perhaps with Jackie and Mike, how do we improve this, the identity of members as owners, and how does this additionally benefit the co-op?
Yeah, look, I think it's something that we have worked towards, but it's just that continual communication and education, and really demonstrating to them what they get out of the cooperative. As I think I said, the people, when new members join us, they probably don't really understand. They're not joining necessarily because of the benefits of the cooperative. They're joining for the ease of transaction and the ease of doing business, and to improve their small business that they're trying to run. But looking at different ways to be able to demonstrate back to them the power of the cooperative is really important. But we've struggled, as I said, we've kind of struggled with that. Like we feel you think you do that in your communications, and that's the area I help look after for the business, and they purchase shares, and we pay dividends, and we give rebates, and we invite them to elect their member directors and join in our be part of their cooperative. But I don't know. I think for us, it's small business owners. They're so busy. They're so busy trying to run their business. They don't always have that time to think about the other side, but they do enjoy the returns. So,
and I think from our side, it is totally about the communication pieces and how you communicate, and you can't over communicate, and it's finding the ways that people want to be communicated with that sort of are meaningful for them, to reinforce the fact that this is their company, so it's not us and them. They're not supplying a wine company; they are the wine company. And I guess that's the beautiful thing for us. We have this in our service. So I just poured a rosé because it's rolled over 5:30 here, and I am a winemaker, and Ross knows that's par for the course. So yeah, we do have something in our arsenal that is going to help us as grape growers, at least. And can I just say, if I don't get the chance to say anything again, Melina, Ros, Carl, and Claudia, well done on putting on the webinar.
Thanks, Mike. We're very jealous of you being able to actually drink literally from the farm gate. We have another question or comment that's a bit of a challenge from Balu, and that is to say that whilst we might be rejoicing in attracting more members to our sector, particularly as Ros pointed out, in New Zealand and Australia, we've grown our membership numbers, we seem to struggle with attracting young people often, or certainly this is about identity, showing younger members of society that we are the ethical business model that they're often seeking. What are some views from the panel on the need to better appeal to the younger generation?
Yeah, it's definitely important for us. So our sort of structure is our members tend to be the business owner of a small automotive business. So often that isn't the younger person. So we generally, a lot of our communications are directed at that business owner, but within the automotive industry and many other industries at the moment, the skills shortage is absolutely dire. And so we are doing a lot of work around trying to talk to apprentices as well, and help our members to attract more apprentices into the industry. And perhaps that's the opportunity to rally with other industry partners to talk to the younger people and entice them not only into the automotive industry, but also to then educate them on the benefits of being part of someone like Capricorn as a cooperative.
Yes, Ros.
I was going to add to that. What's interesting for me is the new co-ops understand why they want to form a co-op, and that's attracting the younger ones. So I find that really interesting. The longer standing organisations such as Fonterra, such as some of our retail members, financial services. If their members are getting older, they understand why they joined the co-op. But the younger ones coming through are very focused on what's in it for me today. You know, I can get X amount of dollars if I go and work with a big corporate versus with the co-op, I get this amount. And so it goes back to that whole education piece of saying the co-op is there to support you through good times and the bad. And so I don't know if you're aware, but in New Zealand, we've had some hideous weather events. And the great thing was a whole lot of Fonterra farmers had to dry out their cows and they still got paid. You know, if you're supplying corporate in the same situation, they weren't being paid. So it's really trying to educate them about why, what's in it for them, because that is the younger person's mentality, and really trying to showcase all of the other attributes, as Jackie was talking about with regards to Capricorn, that they do on the members' behalf. It's not just about the financial, it's about the whole wraparound.
And Anne.
Thanks, Melina. I just noticed a comment by Nicola Balnave about education, and it's just this lack of education in the university sector. The model is completely left out of textbooks on business models. So we, you know, I hear Nicola talking about her stories, and I'm really envious Professor Nicola Shadbolt, talking about her stories about working with students, and I'm really envious because we did have a program at University of Newcastle, but it got shut down. But it was so rewarding to work with young people because they were always gobsmacked about this model that exists and that they didn't know about, because for many young people, it completely aligns with the direction that they want to go in. So working together to try and get co-ops back into university and school curricula, I think, is a priority.
Couldn't agree.
That's been a big part of Nicola's work. Nicola, I mean, that's you've been the flag bearer for that in our institutions, so you'll probably want to make a comment on that.
Yeah, we'll just briefly, and hopefully you can hear me. Yeah, I think it's a huge challenge in New Zealand, which is surprising given that you have so many cooperatives. But we are working on it. More recently, I was involved in the secondary school agribusiness curriculum review, and we're very pleased to see they've got cooperatives there as one of the modules that the school students do. And then we're working with the business schools here in New Zealand just to say, look, at least put it in your 101 organisational structure page, just so that it's identified as it's a perfectly normal option that exists rather than something odd we need to understand at some later point. So we're working on it. It's still work in progress, but it seems very odd for it to be so obviously missing in our business school, because it's, you know, to Roger's point, it's a big part of our economy.
I think you know, for us, attracting new members is such a high barrier to entry, buying a vineyard. But there are ways we're thinking about that, you know, around syndication, for example. And which sort of fits a co-op sort of level of thinking as well. But you hit on something, Anne, there, just around storytelling. If we're attracting new members or new consumers, for those of us with brands, it's the storytelling bit that's so powerful. And we're only just starting to really use our members to good effect, because there's such great stories to tell. Someone in the UK is, you know, here's the grape grower. This is what his family looks like. This is what he does on his days off. And you can drink his wine. So yeah, storytelling is really rich.
I think this commentary that's coming through on ways to better communicate our business model and our principles and the unique characteristics of cooperatives is a really rich way to wrap up today's discussion. Perhaps if I could ask, first of all, if you haven't read the wonderful chat box that's going on with commentary from people like Professor Mazarol, it's a really interesting read. But perhaps if I could ask each of the panelists for their final remarks, just something that they've heard from the other panelists, or taking away something for us to take away today. So without forward notice, I'll start with you, Ros. Have you got any concluding remarks or thoughts?
I just, in terms of the 7 principles, there's been touching on the sustainability being added to principle number 7. And I think there is a general consensus that that would be a really good opportunity, whether it's the sustainability of the businesses, but obviously sustainability in terms of the environment. So I think that that's something that definitely should be considered.
Great, thank you very much. Nicola, have you got some just concluding remarks or thoughts?
I think, well, firstly, it's been fantastic to have such a diverse group here and to hear about what's going on elsewhere. And also, I think, you know, that legislative bit is so important that Anne was talking about, because quite often a country is constrained by what is in the legislation. And I mean, the example I have of somebody who wasn't taught cooperatives in his degree was my son, who's now a lawyer, and in his first year he didn't cover cooperatives. Now his mother gave him plenty of information, but whether they listen or not is another story. But I think just to ensure that all those who serve us actually understand us is important. And so, you know, whether it's the lawyers, the accountants, those who come and work for us, you know, agency risk is a huge problem in cooperatives. Well, not a problem. It's a challenge in cooperatives, because the members do have to remind some of their, you know, those they employ what the cooperative is there for. And so, with the exception, obviously, of people like Mike, who absolutely has you know, embraced it. But my observation, certainly in Fonterra, is that there were ones who didn't. And so I think that's it. I'm talking far too long, but so that was a brief comment on Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola.
Thank you,
Anne, have you got some final remarks?
Just something that came back to me from something you mentioned earlier on, Milena, and that is that and Ros, you were both talking about the fact that this is a consultation about whether the principles need updating or changing. And I think around the room, most people are sort of fairly consistent in their views that they shouldn't be adding any more principles in, because there's enough flexibility in the existing principles to update the interpretation of the principles to make sure that they reflect what's going on today. And without wanting to create work for anybody, but I do think there's an opportunity here for New Zealand and Australia to put together some ideas on what those principles mean in our countries and in our legal, political, economic circumstances. So.
Great idea, Anne. I'll come back to you on that. Volunteered for that, Anne. Jackie.
Yeah, thanks. Look, it was fascinating discussion today. I think there's definitely come through that some consistency and some themes around, you know, the importance of those 7 principles. And yes, I agree, Ros, around the opportunity to add some more commentary around sustainability. I think the other thing coming through is that, you know, that kind of continual communication of the power of the cooperative and perhaps how we all work together towards the 2025 year of the cooperative to actually kind of hit that goal in that year.
Thanks, Jackie. And Mike, very short concluding remark.
Just what amazes me is just the diversity of the sector, so small, large, different sectors. But yeah, I guess, you know, ecumenically, what unites us is the core principles, isn't it? And having that as the core of your beliefs. So yeah, fascinating and rich to be involved in the cooperative movement, because you do have insight into all of those different styles of business. But yeah, we're actually sort of all doing the same thing, but just, you know, in slightly different ways.
Thank you. Thank you very much again. I'd like to thank all of our speakers and thank again Cooperative Business New Zealand, our colleagues in today's webinar, as well as everyone who's been on the call. I'm very aware we've just ticked over the 4 o'clock mark, or here in Australia, that's the time. Wherever you are, thank you for being on this wonderful conversation. I'm just going to give 3 ideas about how you don't need to walk away from this webinar thinking that's the end of the conversation. The ICA is encouraging cooperative organisations and businesses and individuals to organise your own self-guided event to keep the discussion going. And there's been several topics that have arisen today that are worthy of more discussion. There is a toolkit that's available. We will send you the links to all of these. Please read the Cooperative Identity Statement if you haven't done so. And many of us haven't read it in full, but it is a resource that's available globally, and it's a great starting point. And there is a link that will provide you to the Global Cooperative Identity website and resources where you can follow the global consultation. But what's most important is we start with what we know in our own jurisdictions and our own organisations. And Ros and I will be conveying the outcomes of this consultation to the ICA to share our views. So thank you again, everyone, for coming. I trust you have a wonderful festive season as well, since most of you are going into that break. And we look forward to having more of these conversations in 2024. Thank you, everyone.